And so what we're going to do now is specifically discuss the development of narratives from about Brown Stage 2 through Brown Stage 5. And so our learning objectives for this lecture are to explain why narratives are important to language development, and then I want you to explain the general progression of narrative development up to episodic development. And so we're first going to look at the definition and background knowledge of narratives. The development of narratives has important ramifications on almost all aspects of language development and later literacy development. It is through the use of narratives that children have an opportunity to practice language and develop an understanding of how storytelling works. Those two particular skills are critical for success in later academic environments. Additionally, they are critical for the development of contextualized language, which is very important in European American linguistic culture. Before we jump on to how narratives begin to develop, we have to be able to define what a narrative is. There are many definitions of a narrative. One of the most basic is one that involves a minimum of two sequential events that are logically ordered and related. A common way to think about this is in terms of whether they are temporally related or not. In the previous slide, we were talking a little bit about why narratives are important. We know that it is a key way in which children learn about how academic discourse works. What this means is that for many of the experiences that we have in school, we must understand how stories work and how we speak about things that are decontextualized. Through early and later experiences with narratives, children have the opportunity to develop the skill. Additionally, when we tell stories, we have the opportunity to use more complex syntax and more developed words. Therefore, this particular discourse type is important for being able to practice these skills as well. As we were discussing in the previous slide, there are many different types of definitions of narratives that are also related to different types of narrative genres. On this slide, we have some major types of genres listed. The first is a recount. This might be just a recollection of past experiences that are requested by an adult. For example, a teacher might ask a student to summarize a section of a textbook, or a caregiver might ask a child to tell them what happened earlier in the day. Another example of a narrative type is an event cast. Here there is an explanation of an event that happens. We might think about this in terms of sharing how to do something. For example, a child might be describing how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or an adult might be giving you directions of how to get to a place. The next type of narrative is an account. Here we are simply sharing our experiences. This does not typically happen at the request of someone. For example, it might be that I talk about a vacation, or I might be relating to someone what happened in the basketball game over the weekend. The final type of narrative is a story. Here we might be retelling a fictional story. When we get to school-age language, this is the type of narrative that we're going to be concentrating on. Different cultures have different types of narratives that they emphasize. In European American culture, the story is really important in school-age language. Across cultures, there are differences in the way we tell stories as well. What we're doing here is just emphasizing some of the points that we made previously. That is, children, as they are developing language, have an opportunity to use this particular discourse context to develop many different skills. We can see here on the slide that we're talking about the development of almost all of the domains of language. Additionally, we spoke about the relationship of academic success and literacy development. However, as different cultures have different points of emphasis in storytelling, it is important to consider some of these differences when we're examining narrative development in children. One of the things that we just referenced was the fact that there are different cultural differences that exist in the production of narratives. This is interesting as we know that the use of narratives is universal. The difference is that different cultures have, the difference is, that different cultures have different ways of sharing these narratives. This is why the actual schema of a narrative is not universal. One of the things that we're going to be speaking about in this lecture is the development of narratives through the emergence of story grammar. This story grammar, or story schema, is commonly used in American schools. However, it is possible that children who come from different cultural backgrounds are familiar with different types of story schemas. It's therefore possible that these children might be mistaken as having a language disorder when they truly have a language difference. One of the ways in which culture influences the development of narratives is that in some cultures, narratives are what are called low context, and in other cultures, they are high context. European American culture is low context. What this means is that there is a pretty strict story grammar that is followed that aids in the understanding of this decontextualized information. In contrast to that, high context cultures do not necessarily follow this story grammar. Additionally, it might be that narratives are more predominantly shared about things that have greater context than in low context cultures. And so it should be recognized by this point that what is considered a well-formed narrative can vary across different cultures. Interestingly, although there has been a lot of research centered around narratives, those research studies rarely mention the differences between cultures. This can make a substantial difference in the results that are obtained in these particular studies. In this particular subsection, we will be focusing on the development of narratives. Here we will be taking a little detour from the way it's described in the textbook. The terminology that we will use in this lecture subsumes much of the information that is shared in the textbook. This is just a little sketch of how narratives develop from the time children begin speaking through the school-age years. We will be focusing on the period of around 2 through 5 during this lecture. We can see that some of the things that happen in ages 2 and 3 have a clear developmental importance in how narratives become more plot-driven. As narratives become more about plot, and as children move into the school-age years, their stories become more complex and more coherent. In fact, it's possible that they begin embedding multiple episodes within a single story. In this lecture, we're focusing on what happens before children begin to use episodes within narratives. In our discussion of school-age narratives, we will begin defining what episodic structure is. Basically, during these stories, there is no episode, there is no story arc, and this is what we would traditionally expect in a story. This terminology is a simplified way of looking at other descriptions of narrative development, specifically in terms of what are called heaps, sequences, primitive narratives, unfocused chains, and focus chains. I will not ask you to know this terminology, but I will ask you to know the difference between descriptive, action, and reactive sequences. A descriptive sequence is a collection of statements that do not have the feature of a narrative, right? But occur when we would expect the narrative to occur. If we look at the example on this slide, this is taken from a sample in which a child is telling the story about a wordless picture book. This is a pretty common way for clinicians to ask children to tell stories. In this case, the child is talking about the Mercer-Mayer book, A Boy, a Dog, a Frog, and a Friend. Notice that in this story, it is not plot-driven. It is just linking together some of the things that happened. In contrast to this, action sequences are beginning to show a little bit more of the temporal relationship between the utterances of the narrative. Here, we will see more language that links, what it does is it links the sentences together. For example, we might see words like, this happened, then this, next this, and last this. We'll also see the start of the beginning, middle, and end. If you look at the description here from the story, One Frog Too Many, you can see that each of the utterances are linked in a temporal fashion. This makes it more cohesive and coherent. However, what's lacking is what we consider to be important in the telling of stories with aspects such as a climax, a conclusion, and an introduction. It would be possible for the different aspects of this story to be reordered without changing the particular meaning of the story. The final developmental type of narrative that occurs before children develop episodic structure is what's called a reactive sequence. In this case, we begin to see more causal relations that develop during the story. However, the main character is not expressing any feelings or attempt to resolve the complication of some sort. These are the types of things that we would more traditionally see in stories. As children move into the school age years, they develop what is called episodic structure. This is what we think about when we think about more traditional stories. We will discuss this in great depth when we discuss school-aged language. And so our learning objectives were to explain why narratives are important to language development and to explain the general progression of narrative development up to episodic development. And so what I want you to do is to create an example of a narrative with a descriptive sequence, an action sequence, and a reactive sequence. And so our learning objectives for the entire lecture, actually, these are the learning objectives from the pragmatics lecture. So if you scroll down to the bottom there, because I used to have them combined, it was, of course, what we just said. So explaining why narratives are important to language development and the general progression of narrative development up to episodic development.